Welcome back to the Compressor Guru. Today's a different episode. We're not going to fix anything, but we're going to explain something to you. This episode was inspired by a viewer that sent a question in. And the question was, can I hook up a two-stage compressor and a one-stage compressor together? And the answer and a local example that we did a little video footage of for this episode will be coming up towards the end of the episode. Multiple compressors are a very common fact of life in any larger shop. I recommend multiple compressors for several reasons. But there are many ways to set up multiple compressors in a factory, air system, body shop. But let's cover a couple of glossary items so I don't have to explain it every time I say a word. Your primary compressor is the one that starts first and probably runs last. Your secondary compressor will start second and probably shut off first or next to last. Sometimes we can adjust them so they'll shut off at the same time, but your primary always starts first, your secondary starts second, and if you have a third one, it starts third. And so
okay, so that answered that question. I'm like, it either shuts off first or next to the last. Okay, go ahead.
You can have sometimes 3 compressors or more. I have several customers with 3 compressors. We're showing some of that as we roll through the footage here today. But there's different ways to set them up, and we're going to go over that. And I want to explain some of the advantages of having multiple compressors as opposed to one giant compressor. I'm going to explain why it's more advantageous to have multiple compressors rather than one giant compressor.
Well, why?
I'm getting to that.
Are you sure? Because, it seems like one big compressor would solve all my problems.
What if it breaks down?
Well, I was just thinking, what if it breaks down?
Yeah. So the first advantage is if you have multiple compressors, you're less likely to be down for air. If you have one big machine and that machine breaks down, shuts off, or even if I'm in there doing PM work, you have to shut the whole factory down. Or
PM work?
What?
PM work?
Preventative maintenance.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So you have to shut the whole factory down, or at least everybody that needs air to operate. And so if you have one machine and you have an issue with that machine, you lose a lot of production. However, if you have multiple machines, you may have one go down and you may not be able to operate at full production, but you can set your priorities and get the important jobs out first and continue to work even though you're not 100%. I didn't get pictures. I have one customer that has 310 horsepowers lined up, and we discussed this when they were setting the factory up. And instead of putting a 30 horsepower in, they have 310 horsepowers, and they're lined up in series. And every once in a while, we rotate the pressure switches so that we change the primary, the secondary, and the
Tertiary.
Third, I think tertiary.
I
might be
believe
the right
tertiary
word.
is correct.
But they've had breakdowns and issues over the years. That's actually, that factory's been there quite a while now. And they've had breakdowns and issues, but they're never completely down because they have several machines, and if they have a breakdown, if they have maintenance, it's not a big problem. The second advantage is the pressure switches can and should be offset so as to get maximum efficiency on your power bill as possible. So your primary compressor, we're talking about a two-stage machine. Your primary compressor will start at about 150 psi and shut down at 175. Your secondary compressor may start at 145, maybe 140, and it'll shut down at 165, 170. Now, what happens is if your first compressor is keeping up with the plant, the factory, the body shop, it will start, it will run, and it'll shut off. But if you're out running with that first machine can produce, the second machine will kick in and help until it is back to where it will shut off and you've made enough air. And you can set this up with a great deal of machines, and this is more efficient to start one 5 horsepower and a second 5 horsepower at another time than it is to start a 10 horsepower. Another way to get more efficiency is to use dual pilots. You can use dual pilots on multiple machines also and set them up in series like this. What are you laughing at, woman? What you don't see is I just had to cut out because I couldn't get multiple machines out, and that's like the 4th time, and anyway, it's gone. Let me know if you want bloopers. By using dual pilot systems, it also eliminates wear and tear on your compressor. The compressor will run cooler because it's running and unloaded and will be cooling itself without making the heat. And it is also easier on the electric bill because you don't have start, stop, start, stop. That motor takes very little amperage to spin that compressor when it's unloaded. So this is another control system for your multiple machines. Third advantage, with how expensive a compressor is, at least in your smaller units like your 5s and your 10s, oftentimes it's just about the same price to buy 2 5 horsepowers as it is to buy one 10 horsepower. And that being said, the 10 horsepower machine, almost always you're going to need 3-phase power. So if you're in a shop that doesn't have 3-phase electric power, and let's say you need 35 cubic feet of air, you're not going to get that out of a 5 horsepower by itself. You'll need 2 5 horsepowers. And it's almost a wash on what it costs to buy 2 5 horsepowers and a 10 horsepower. So if you have single phase power, you can still get more air by buying multiple machines, and you can get actually more efficiency by setting them up at different pressures to run. Speaking of different pressures to run, let's talk about controls. I already mentioned the dual pilot, but there's another system called an alternator switch, and it's very common on what's called duplex machines or tandem machines. And this is an electric switch that will start the left compressor this time. When it runs up in cycles, it'll start the right compressor next time. And if you're out running one of the compressors, it'll kick the other one in. But it literally alternates between the left and the right pump. And you can set them up on different machines, but it's an expensive switch, and it's best to have it factory ordered on a duplex machine, and that eliminates some interesting wiring for what would be perhaps non-industrial electricians. That's as nice as I can put it. Another control solution is, I'm showing you here one of my customers. I'm not allowed to say where it's at. It's actually in a pretty secure location. And these are two 20 horsepower Ingersolls controlled by a computer controller mounted on the wall. This is a very interesting setup. The left compressor runs for 1 week, 24 hours non-stop. Tuesday mornings at 8:30. The computer starts the other compressor, and once it's up running and all the parameters are okay, it will shut the left compressor down. If one of the compressors goes down during its 1 week run, it will start the other compressor when the pressure drops appropriately. This controller is very interesting because it can run up to 8 screw compressors with the IR Intellisys system. It is a very neat system, and I got this customer because they couldn't figure out, they had a glitch in it. There was a programming problem that the previous owner put into it, and they called us to solve it. And the book on the controller, the computer on the wall, is about 4 inches thick just on the troubleshoot manual. It is really quite the piece of engineering. So there's many ways you can set up multiple compressors.
Question.
Yeah.
So if a computer like that was at a place where if you had like a transformer blew up somewhere around here today, we lost power for 15 minutes. Does it reset itself?
The short answer is yes. One last thing about this computer. If a machine goes down, there's only somebody on site for about 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. But if one of these machines has a hiccup, it actually calls the tech that works there, it calls his cell phone and lets him know there's an issue with a compressor, because both of them don't dare go down. So it's very interesting, very expensive, very complicated setup. You can see from the clips we're running that there's many ways to set up multiple compressors and systems. I don't have footage of this particular customer's compressor room, but he has a 10 horsepower and he has a 50 horsepower. And normally you'd say, well, their 50 horsepower has to be their primary. Well, for a long time it was. Then they looked at the electric bill and they tried to get by on the 10 horsepower, and they were easily able to get by. So now they run on the 10 horsepower. When they went from the 50 horsepower as being the primary to the 10 horsepower being the primary, they saved $500 a month. That's saving about $6,000 a year.
In electricity?
Yes.
Is that what you're saving?
Yes,
Okay.
in power.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't use the word light bill because
They
it's
don't
not-
run the lights, it's the compressor.
They have lights, but killing me, woman. So, send comments to the camera wife. So they are saving about $500 a month or $6,000 a year just in the electric bill. In addition to that, they don't need me in there every 3 months servicing the 50 horsepower screw. We service the 10 horsepower once a year, and we service the 50 when the hours are enough, which has been several cycles now because it's not running. So the biggest compressor doesn't have to be the primary compressor.
Interesting.
I thought it was. Another reason not to make, here's another customer that we did get some pictures of. They have 2 5s and a 7.5. They don't have 3-phase. Here's another example of the larger compressor not being the primary compressor. The shop does not have 3-phase power. They got a 2 5s that are almost new. They're less than a year old right now, and they have a 7.5 single phase. And
Oh, can I guess?
what?
Can I guess why you don't want to use that 7.5?
Yes.
Because the 7.5, there's something about it. It's motor or something wears out quicker, and they are so expensive to run. No, they're so expensive to replace and repair. So it is much better to use the 5 horsepower and the 5 horsepower and then make the 7.5 last, because it's so expensive to replace whatever part that is that we've talked about and had to do before. It sounds like it should be the better thing because it has a bigger tank and it does this and it does that, but it's really not. I would never recommend a 7.5.
I don't.
I know. Me neither.
That's a very good answer, but it's not why.
Oh, never mind.
The real reason why is that 7.5 was the number 2 compressor for 20, 25 years, however old it is. And the primary compressor tossed its cookies. And that's when we put the 2 5s in to replace the 7.5. And because of the age of the machine, we made the larger machine the 3rd machine that starts and runs. It's near the end of its service life. And
that brings you to what I said. Yeah.
Yes, it does, but we'll just go there. So, we got married in 85, folks. I'm up to 20 happy years. So, anyway, and I keep her guessing. I don't tell her which are the happy years. So, anyway, yeah, what she said about the motor is absolutely correct. The motors do have a shorter life, being 7.5 single phase. But the reason we're not setting that one up as the primary is because the compressor is in the last years of its life, and it only has to run every once in a great while with the other 2 compressors set up like this. So there's lots of reasons to not just walk lockstep and set a compressor up as a primary because it's the biggest. There's lots of different reasons to do things like this. Now we're going to get down to answer the question from the viewer about setting a 2-stage compressor up and a single-stage compressor up in the same system. Now, a 2-stage machine starts at 150, shuts off at 175. And I actually have a customer set up like this. And the single-stage machine generally starts at about 110 and shuts off at 125. This customer, who's a road construction company, bought the 10 horsepower screw that you see in this picture, and they have all kinds of issues with it. It's a fine machine, but screws aren't always the right compressor depending on the application you're using it for. A screw works wonderfully when you put it in a factory and you need a certain amount of air for every minute of the day to keep the assembly line up. But when you run a screw start-stop and maybe you need a lot of air for an hour and then you don't use it for 3 hours and it starts back up and you use it for 20 minutes and it's off for the rest of the day, that's very hard on the screw. It's very hard on a lot of things, the controls, the belts, the pulleys, the temperature it runs at. There's condensation problems with the oil. So this customer was having problems with this machine that I didn't sell them. They saw it and say, yeah, it's a nice machine. Let's get the latest, greatest. And then they bought the 10 horse Ingersoll off me, and they wanted to put them both together, and the only way to do it is, here's the answer, check valve. So we put a check valve in the system, and it keeps the air from backfeeding into the single stage tank, which the maximum working pressure on that tank on the screw is 160 pound. So with that being the maximum working pressure, it's also the safety valve on that tank. And if it gets 161 pounds in that tank, that safety valve will pop. So we have to keep the pressure from backfeeding into the screw, and we use a check valve to do that. So that's your answer to how do you tie them together. The one thing you've got to have in mind is that your primary compressor is always going to be your two-stage in this particular scenario. Folks, that's the answer. That's the episode. We appreciate you. If you want to have a question answered like this, shoot us an email. Contact us through thecompressorguru.com. I wish I had a jingle to sing that like some of these other companies.
.com.
.com. Yeah, I think we're ripping that off. So.
No, not the way you just sang it.
Okay. Anyway, like, subscribe, hit the bell. If you have an idea, suggestion for an episode like Paul from Texas did, we're going to be doing his episode coming up in a couple weeks. If you have an idea for an episode, shoot it in. If it makes sense and I can explain it, we'll do it. God bless you. Have a great day.
So is this kind of like Mythbusters for compressors? Can you put a single stage and a double stage together? Well, let's see if we can. Let's set up the explosive to go boom. Goodbye.
Okay. I'll run in after the freeze frame. Love you, babe.
So am I
That's
not
it.
taking...
Go to another one of the episodes.